Hello, hello, hello everyone. My name is John Sierra and I'm a Tolkien scholar. And what that essentially means is that I know a lot about Tolkien because I've been studying him for a really long time, decades in fact, and I'm the kind of guy that you can come to with any sort of question about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, whether it is The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings or The Silmarillion, Unfinished Tales, The Great Tales, his translations, his life, anything you can come up with, his letters, and all that stuff. So, we have 11 questions to get through today, and we also have a new feature on the channel that we're going to talk about a little bit now and a little bit at the end. Well, a little bit now and a lot at the end of the video. But first, let's just say all the normal stuff that we start with, like the video, comment on the video, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And if you're thinking that's presumptuous, I'll ask you again at the end of the video. That way you know that by that point that you will have gotten through the whole video, which means you must have enjoyed it. And then you'll say, okay, now I will do it. But just a reminder to please do that. And we've been, using pretty much the same format for a while, and I'm just going to shake it up just very slightly here by doing a little bit of addition. Normally I have an intro, and I tell you about myself, and then I do a reading, and then we get into the questions, and then we have an outro, and that's pretty much it. Last week's live stream, where I was doing a live reading of The Two Towers, being the second part of The Lord of the Rings, I came up with the idea, I forgot exactly the exact genesis of it, but I came up with the idea of posting quizzes on the community tab. And I know a lot of you guys have seen these quizzes that I've been posting every day since then, because you guys have been answering them and whatnot. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue these daily quizzes, just simple trivia questions about the works of Tolkien, and they're all multiple choice. And of course, when you click it, it will tell you whether you got it right or wrong, and it will tell you sort of an explanation for the answer. And what I'm going to do is at the end of the video, after the questions, but before the outro, I'm going to review those questions and sort of just go over them with you a little bit and just real quick, and also just sort of comment on the amount of people that got them right, because I was a little surprised at some of them that I thought were easier questions that were not, people were not getting right, and some of them that I thought were harder that a lot of people were getting right. So it's sort of interesting the way that works out. Of course, that'll be at the end of the video, so I just wanted to talk about that here. Now, as for questions, if you want to submit a question to me, you can ask a question, of course, in the comments section, and I'll answer it there as soon as I can. But if you want to submit a question that you hope will be in a video, there are two ways to do this. One way that you can do it is through a website called Quora, and I'm a very established writer on Quora. I have over 5,000 followers on there. I have over 80 million views on there. So if you ask any sort of question about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, you're going to get a list of people that you could tag in. They call it an ask to answer. And you'll get a list of names of people who know about the subject that you are asking about. Because you can ask about any sort of question on Quora. It's a knowledge-sharing platform where you can ask a question and have people with knowledge or wisdom or experience in whatever manner of things answer you. Or complete maniacs. That can happen too. But anyway, you'll get a list of people. My name will be at or near the top of the list, or you can just go to the description of this video. There is a link both to my Quora space, which is called the Grey Havens, and my Quora account, where you can click Ask a Question there and do it that way. If you want to do it through YouTube, but not in the comments section, I just want to be a free-for-all, but if you want to submit through YouTube, you can do it through the community page, which is only available on mobile as far as I can tell. You bring up the mobile app, you go to my channel, and there is a little button that says join the community, and you can ask a question there, and I will consider the questions asked there to be submissions for a video question. I will just ask that if you have multiple questions, do multiple posts. Don't try to put them all in one post, because sometimes I'll want to answer one right away, but maybe hold off on another, and because I have to do some research or something, and I don't want to lose track of it. So, like, if you have multiple questions, don't be afraid to make multiple posts. I'm absolutely fine with that. So I wanted to read to you today from The Return of the King, being the third part of The Lord of the Rings. And I'm going to read from the chapter Many Partings, where this is after the fall of Sauron. It's after the coronation of the king, Aragorn. and the wedding to the Lady Arwen, and the funeral of Theoden, and the ascension of his nephew, King Éomer of Rohan. And they're on their way home. And they haven't quite reached Rivendell, where they'll stay there for a while with Bilbo and Elrond, and then, of course, go home, passing through Bree and talking to Barlam and Butterbur, and then, of course, there's the scouring of the Shire. I wanted to read from this chapter Many Partings, which is before they've reached Rivendell. It takes place in Dunland, and as they're traveling to the north from Rohan to Rivendell, they run into Saruman. And this is something that I feel not a lot of people talk about, is this interaction with Saruman, where it does indeed foreshadow. There's a lot of foreshadowing for the events that will lead to the scouring of the Shire, including Saruman being missing at Orthanc, and Treebeard admitting that he has let him go, and of course this meeting on the road where Saruman appears to be a lowly beggar and really, completely defeated. And he has a bit of a nasty repartee with our heroes and then disappears, and you think that might be the end of him, but then in Bree, Gandalf says, well, I don't know, I think he's up to something still, But anyway, I feel like a lot of people talk about, Saruman, the voice of Saruman, where he has his confrontation with Gandalf the White, and a lot of people talk about his confrontation with the hobbits, right after the scouring of the Shire. Of course, scouring, by the way, a lot of people get this wrong. Scouring means cleaning roughly, sort of a violent cleaning. So people will say, Saruman scoured the Shire. No, Merry and Pippin and Frodo and Sam and a bunch of other hobbits scoured the Shire. What Saruman would do, we would say, would be the ruination of the Shire, the bespoiling of the Shire. But anyway, I feel like this whole passage doesn't really get enough attention, so I'm going to read it to you guys. Here we go. The travellers now rode with more speed, and they made their way towards the Gap of Rohan, and Aragorn took leave of them at last, close to that very place where Pippin had looked into the stone of Orthanc. The hobbits were grieved at that parting, for Aragorn had never failed them, and he had been their guide through many perils. I wish we could have a stone that we could all see our friends in, said Pippin, and that we could speak to them from far away. Only one now remains that you could use, answered Aragorn, for you would not wish to see what the stone of Minas Tirith would show you, but the Palantir of Orthanc the king will keep, to see what is passing in his realm, and what his servants are doing. For do not forget, Peregrine Took, that you are a knight of Gondor, and I do not release you from your service. You are going now on leave, but I may recall you, and remember, dear friends of the Shire, that my realm lies also in the north, and I shall come there one day. Then Aragorn took leave of Celeborn and Galadriel, and the lady said to him, Elfstone, through darkness you have come to our hope, and have now all you desire. Use well the days. But Celeborn said, Kinsman, farewell. May your doom be other than mine, and your treasure remain with you till the end. With that they parted, and it was then the time of sunset. And when after a while they turned and looked back, they saw the King of the West, sitting upon his horse with his knights about him, and the falling sun shone about them, and made all their harness to gleam like red gold, and the white mantle of Aragorn was turned to a flame. Then Aragorn took the green stone and held it up, and there came a green fire from his hand. Soon the dwindling company followed the Isen, turned west and rode through the gap into the wastelands beyond, and then they turned northward and passed over the borders of Dunland. The Dunlandings fled and hid themselves, for they were afraid of elvish folk, though few indeed ever came to their country. But the travellers did not heed them, for they were still a great company, and were well provided with all that they needed. And they went on their way at their leisure, setting up their tents when they would. On the 6th day since their parting from the king, they journeyed through a wood, climbing down from the hills at the feet of the misty mountains that now marched on their right hand. As they came out again into the open country at sundown, they overtook an old man leaning on a staff, and he was clothed in rags of grey or dirty white, and at his heels went another beggar slouching and whining. Well, Saruman, said Gandalf, where are you going? What is that to you? He answered. Will you still order my goings, and are you not content with my ruin? You know the answer, said Gandalf, no, and no. But in any case, the time of my labours now draws to an end. The king has taken on the burden. If you had waited at Orthanc, you would have seen him, and he would have shown you wisdom and mercy. Then all the more reason to have left sooner, said Saruman, for I desire neither of him. Indeed, if you wish for an answer to your first question, I am seeking a way out of his realm. Then once more you are going the wrong way, said Gandalf, and I see no hope in your journey. But will you scorn our help, for we offer it to you? To me, said Saruman. Nay, pray tell, do not smile at me. I prefer your frowns, and as for the lady here, I do not trust her. She always hated me and schemed for your part. I do not doubt that she has brought you all the way to have the pleasure of gloating over my poverty. Had I been warned of your pursuit, I would have denied you the pleasure. Saruman, said Galadriel, we have other errands and other cares that seem to us more urgent than hunting for you. Say, rather, that you are overtaken by good fortune, for now you have at last chance. If it be truly the last, I am glad, said Saruman, for I shall be spared the trouble of refusing it again. All my hopes are ruined, but I would not share yours, if you have any. For a moment his eyes kindled. Go, he said. I did not spend long study on these matters for naught. You have doomed yourself, and you know it. And it will afford me some comfort as I wander to think that you pulled down your own house when you destroyed mine. And now, what ship will bear you across a sea so wide? He mocked. It will be a grey ship, and full of ghosts. He laughed, but his voice was cracked and hideous. Get up, you idiot, he shouted to the other beggar, who had sat down on the ground, and he struck him with his staff. Turn about! If these fine folk are going our way, then we will take another. Get on, or I'll give you no crust for your supper. The beggar turned and slouched past, whimpering, Poor old Grima, poor old Grima. Oh, he's beaten and cursed. How I hate him. I wish I could leave him. Then leave him, said Gandalf. But Wormtongue only shot a glance of his bleared eyes full of terror at Gandalf, and then shuffled quickly past Saruman. As the wretched pair passed by the company, they came to the hobbits, and Saruman stopped and stared at them, but they looked at him with pity. So you have come to gloat too, have you, my urchins? He said. You don't care what a beggar lacks, do you? For you have all you want, food and fine clothes, and the best weed for your pipes. Oh, yes, I know where it comes from. You would not give a pipeful to a beggar, would you? I would if I had any, said Frodo. You can have what I've got left, said Merry. If you'll wait a moment. He got down and searched in his bag. Let's try that again. He got down and searched in the bag at his saddle. Then he handed to Saruman a leather pouch. Take what there is, he said. You are welcome to it. It came from the flotsam of Isengard. Mine, yes, and dearly bought, cried Saruman, clutching at the pouch. This is only a repayment and token, for you took more, I'll be bound. Still, a beggar must be grateful if a thief returns him even a morsel of his own. Well, it will serve you right when you come home if you find things less good in the South Farthing than you would like. Long may your land be short of leaf. Thank you, said Merry. In that case, I will have my pouch back, which is not yours, and has journeyed far with me. Wrap the weed in a rag of your own. One thief deserves another, said Saruman, and turned his back on Merry and kicked Wormtongue, and went away towards the wood. Well, I like that, said Pippin. Thief, indeed. What of our claim for waylaying, wounding, and orc dragging us through Rohan? Ah, said Sam, and bought, he said. How, I wonder. And I didn't like the sound of what he said about the South Farthing. It's time we got back. I'm sure it is, said Frodo, but we can't go any quicker if we had to see Bilbo. I'm going to Rivendell first, whatever happens. Yes, I think you'd better do that, said Gandalf. But alas for Saruman. I fear nothing more can be made of him. He is withered altogether. All the same, I am not sure that Treebeard is right. I fancy he could do some mischief still in a small, mean way. Okay. So there's a lot that we could mention here, Gandalf especially saying that Saruman is still capable of evil, but in a small, mean way, sort of answers the question that a lot of people have about why Gandalf at the end of the story would not enter the Shire. Why would he not assist the hobbits in ousting Saruman and Grima and the brigands that they had brought into the Shire? Why would he not assist with the scouring of the Shire, and instead chose to travel into the Old Forest and have some sort of treaty with Tom Bombadil, of which we are absolutely not privy to? We have no inkling of what they talked about. It could have been a whole lot of, great lore that we just never will hear, or it could have been the weather. It could have been nothing at all, But, there really is two types of evil. There's great evil, and there's petty evil. And Saruman has never been great evil. He has only ever been petty evil. He was good once, of course. Nothing is evil in the beginning. Not even Sauron, not even Morgoth was evil in the beginning. But he aspired to be something greater. He never aspired to be evil, but he was always small potatoes, we would say, because he never managed to do any real damage that didn't lead to something greater, which is, the theme of the Ainur Lindala, that evil, through all its efforts, will only make good greater. And he is not the enemy. He's not the great evil of Morgoth or Sauron. He has more in common with the Bill Fernies of the world. And of course, there is the many hints that we've gotten. A lot of the Bill Fernies of the world are really Saruman's minions. They work for him. Or, they don't love him. They're not loyal to him. Even the Uruk-hai might have loved him. They called him Sharku, which he misheard as Sharky. It means old man. They sort of saw him as a father figure. But when you have the loyalty of orcs, that's not necessarily a good thing. And the true great evil, the true Dark Lords, don't have the loyalty of the orcs. They have the fear of the orcs. They have, a sort of sniveling respect of the orcs. Another thing that I want to point out here is the absolute nadir of Wormtongue here. He doesn't really speak up for himself in the way that he does, just before his death in after the scouring of the Shire. But he's just sort of become almost like Gollum, where he's just like, poor old Grima, I wish I hate him, I wish I could leave him, speaking to himself and sort of muttering and scraping and bowing. It reminds us of Gollum, and much like Gollum was eventually the downfall of Sauron, Grima, of course, was the downfall of Saruman. And what's interesting is that there was a prophecy for both of those. For Gollum, the prophecy was made by Gandalf when he said that he feels in his heart that Gollum will have a part to play in the story before its end, for good or for ill. And of course, Gollum was the one who destroyed the One Ring, so he had a very great part to play, a very important part to play. The prophecy about Grima is not found in The Lord of the Rings. It's actually found in Unfinished Tales, and it was made by the Witch King, of all people, because it explains that, we know from The Lord of the Rings that some sort of emissary of Sauron may or may not have been Nazgul. I am of the opinion that it was not Nazgul, that it was something more akin to the mouth of Sauron, or maybe even the actual mouth of Sauron, who came to Erebor and asked the king under the mountain, Dane the Second Ironfoot, for the location of the Shire, and one Mr. Bilbo Baggins, and they sort of just stonewalled him, saying, oh, well, I'll have to think about it, because they were promising, rings of power and the friendship of Mordor and all this stuff. And of course, Dane was never going to do that. He was just sort of, buying time while he sent Gimli and Gloin off to Rivendell to warn Bilbo, and also to seek the counsel of Elrond. And we know that Dane did not sell out Bilbo, so we discover, how did the Nazgul eventually come to find the Shire and, where it is located? And we find out that they actually went to Saruman. And Saruman basically, there's a few different versions, and in one version he says, I don't know. In another version he says, the hobbits, they live at the Vales of the Anduin. And, of course, they did at one point live in the Vales of the Anduin, but they don't anymore. And they realize, the Nazgul realize that Saruman, is not loyal to Sauron, and that he is deceiving them and working towards his own means. But they find Wormtongue while he's traveling. I don't know, I forget whether he was coming to Isengard or coming from Isengard, but they find him on the road and they terrorize him, and he gives it all up. He tells them where the Shire is and everything. And a lot of people think, well, the smart thing to do is just get rid of him right there, right? But the Witch King decides to let Grima go because he has a feeling that Grima, as a free person, is going to do more damage to Saruman than anybody else can, that he's going to be Saruman's downfall. So even the bad guys, have their prophecies and they come true here. Anyway, guys, we have 11 questions to get through this week, as well as reviewing the quizzes from the past week. So let's get started with your first question. Our first question was submitted by Time Lord Victorious, who asks, in the Silmarillion, it says that Aule gathers the dwarves up when they die. Does this mean he shows them the way to Mandos? Is there no afterlife for them? So first, as we must always do when a single line is sort of cherry-picked, we have to just, and ask for clarification. We have to put it back into context here. So I'm going to read you the full paragraph from the Silmarillion, which is from the chapter of Aule and Yavanna. Since they were to come in the days of the power of Melkor, Aule made the dwarves strong to endure. Therefore, they are stone-hard, stubborn, fast in friendship and enmity, and they suffer toil and hunger and hurt of body more heartily than all other speaking peoples, and they live long, far beyond the span of men, yet not forever. Aforetime it was held among the elves in Middle-earth that dying, the dwarves returned to the earth and the stone of which they were made. And that is not their own belief. For they say that Aule the Maker, whom they call Mehal, cares for them, and gathers them to Mandos in halls set apart, and that he declared to the fathers of old that Iluvatar will hallow them, and give them a place among the children in the end. Then their part shall be to serve Aule, and to aid him in the remaking of Arda after the last battle. They say also that the 7 fathers of the dwarves return to live again in their own kin, and to bear once more their ancient names, of whom Durin was the most renowned in after ages, father of that kindred most friendly to the elves, whose mansions were at Khazad-dûm. So we know that the dwarves are not children of Iluvatar. They were not something that were sung of in the music of the Holy Ones, and they were not planned to exist by Iluvatar. Aule, like Melkor, he lamented the emptiness, and he was impatient to fill the world, and in Melkor's case it was the void, with creatures of his own design. In the case of Melkor, it was because he wanted to be God. In the case of Aule, he explained that he just loved to create, and he didn't mean to cause any disrespect by it. The dwarves, they get Iluvatar's approval, and then Aule churns out 6 more dwarves. He had initially made 7 male dwarves, and then he makes 6 female dwarves, and then he does as Iluvatar asked him to do. He puts them to sleep in the earth to awaken at a later time so that they could have their place in Middle-earth, but not interfere with the plans that Iluvatar had set out that involved the elves being the first speaking creatures to awaken. So here we are given, in this paragraph that I read, 2 different possibilities of what happens to dwarves when they die. They can return to the earth and stone from which they were made, or they go to Mandos to wait for the end of the world, where they'll take their places alongside the elves and the men, and they'll have a say in the ordering of the world. Now, the second one is what the first one, I should say, is what the elves believe, and the second one is what the dwarves believe. One or the other may be true, or neither may be true, actually. What we choose to believe is up in the air. Tolkien never clarified in any of his letters or other writings which account, if either account, was true. It should be noted that the Elvish account makes dwarves mortal and essentially soulless. They just cease to be when they die. Now, this might be a holdover from the very early encounters with the petty dwarfs, who did not speak to them, though they could speak, and they just attacked indiscriminately. The elves thought they were a form of 2-legged animal, and they hunted them as a danger. Now, we just talked about this in a recent episode, too. Now, later, when they met the proper dwarves, they learned that they were speaking creatures, though they found them to be unlovely, and that the previous encounters were not savage animals, but criminals. So the dwarfish account, though, makes them immortal to a limited extent. Much like the elves, they don't pass from the world until the world itself passes away. So I'm inclined to believe the dwarvish account that they do indeed go to Mandos to await the end of the world. There are 2 reasons. One is literary, and the other is emotional. Now, we'll start with the emotional one because that's easier to explain. The emotional reasoning is that I just simply don't believe that Tolkien would deem a character like, say, Gimli to be without a soul. that would just snuff out into nothingness upon his passing, especially when we consider the fact that he was accepted into the Undying Lands. Mortals are forbidden to go to the Undying Lands, but Gimli was allowed to go there. It could be an exception made by the prayers of the likes of Gandalf or Galadriel, or that Legolas just straight up broke the rules and got away with it, but it could also be that while dwarves die of old age, they are just bound to the world as elves and the Ainur are. I just don't see it being in Tolkien's personality to believe that the dwarves just go back to being dust. The literary reason is that the dwarfish account of what happens when they die is even included in the Silmarillion at all. It is an elvish account, the Silmarillion. It's not a book of dwarf lore. So the fact that the dwarf view is included at all either speaks to the elves realizing the dwarfish account is more likely and including it out of respect while including their own earlier incorrect assumption as a matter of record, or that the translator, the esteemed Mr. Bilbo Baggins, a friend of the dwarves, editorialized in it. And that, that latter choice would be likely require the approval of his patron Elrond, which would lead credence to it regardless. So, dwarves don't have an afterlife yet. This is due to the fact that they were a later addition. They're sort of a +1 for the universe, without a place beyond the circles of the world that is prepared for them, but they, like men, will have their voices heard and they will join the children someday. All right, let's move on to the next question. This next question is requested by Norma, not saying the last name, but Norma, who asks, was the medicine that Merry and Pippin were given stuff Saruman had given the orcs, or was it elf medicine stolen and corrupted evil? I don't think it's either of those things. I think that the orcs made it themselves. I think it is an orcish medicine. Orcs have their own magic, and they don't need to get it from anyone else. In the case of Tolkien's work, the word magic is not used consistently. It can mean a lot of things, but it usually is something of a practiced skill rather than some sort of arcane power. Now, of course, there is the more traditional arcane power style magic. I mean, we have characters like Sauron and Gandalf doing crazy things, but there is also the magic of the races. Case in point would be what is referred to as elf magic, which is a nebulous term that confuses the elves when they hear it, especially when mortals use the same term for the deceits of the enemy that they use to describe elvish skill. Sam asks if the obviously magical rope that he's given is a magic rope, and the nameless elf that gave it to him replies, with confusion, saying, well, it's really just a really great rope. The cloaks that the Fellowship are given are magic cloaks, but the elves are just like, yeah, they're just really good cloaks. We don't know what you're talking about. Gandalf once mentioned that he knew all sorts of magic from various races, including goblins, which are orcs, and even hobbits were said to have everyday magic, which is really just their innate ability to move quietly. They're so good at it that to the races, like, say, the dwarves, who are unable to move that quietly, it seems like magic. Orc magic, or skill, tends towards the destructive ends of things. They can't make beautiful things, but they can make terrible things, including ways to kill a lot of people at once. Machinery is another form of magic to Tolkien, the evil kind in his estimation. And the machines that blot the land, he says, are the devilry of goblins or the devilry of Isengard, where the Uruk-hai were bred. So orcs, of course, they do get wounded, they get banged up all the time, so they have their own form of medicine. And it's not pleasant to the hobbits, but it does work. We might attribute this particular medicine to Saruman if we wish to do so. He was, after all, their father, in a sense. But Saruman didn't create the Uruk-hai out of dirt. They came from breeding stock of both orcs and men, so they would have done some other orcish traditions they would have carried down from their, orc ancestors. So I would say it's just orc medicine. They do need to treat their wounds in some way, so there you have it. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Martin Mika, I think I'm saying it right, Why didn't Sauron hire the Balrog for the invasion of Minas Tirith? The Orcs knew about the Balrog. Well, the Orcs knew about something, which they had a name for it. They called it Gash, which means flame. And now, saying the Orcs knew about the Balrog does not actually translate to Sauron knew about the Balrog. Orcs were in Moria. Yes, some orcs were in fear of a fiery creature that they called Gash. Very true. Some orcs were said to be moving Mithril out of Moria and transporting it to Sauron. This is also true. What's not true is that it was ever said that the orcs that knew of the Balrog were able to articulate what it is, or even desired to articulate what it is, or even that they were the same orcs that knew about Gash. A Balrog would make a fine ally for Sauron, and it is possible that he may have been able to convince the Balrog to join him if he knew about the Balrog. There really isn't any tangible evidence that he knew about the Balrog. Now, the best that people that I've spoken to on Quora have been able to come up with is, well, he had to have known about the Balrog, and their proof is, I mean, come on. It's not really good enough. That being said, by the time Sauron is considering invading Minas Tirith, the Balrog's dead at that point. Sauron was even planning to wait longer to invade Minas Tirith because he was building up his armies to be greater and greater. Moving when he did was actually just too soon, which is a big part of why he lost. Aragorn contacted him via the Palantir, and that made Sauron come to the assumption that Aragorn had the One Ring, causing Sauron to go forward with his attack earlier than he ought to have. One last note, I know that there's some people who are going to go to the comments of the Balrog and the Sauron are equals. He wouldn't work for him. Don't do it. It's incorrect. The fact that they're both Maya spirits doesn't make them equals. There's never any equality when it comes to the evil creatures. There's always one that's above the other. Just like, Manwë and Nessa aren't equals, despite, both being Valar. There's a pecking order to these things. So Sauron was actually in command of Morgoth's armies. He was the guy that was in charge of the whole war in Beleriand, or I should say, the wars in Beleriand. Morgoth wasn't the one giving the orders. The field commanders were probably Balrogs, but the one that gave them the orders, that was probably Sauron. Morgoth was pretty hands-off when it came to giving orders, or if he did give orders, he was giving them through Sauron. But usually it was just Sauron, get it done. I'm putting you in charge. You're going to be the one. Because Sauron was the tactician. So he was the tactician. He was the smart guy. The Balrogs, I'm not saying they're unintelligent. They're very powerful in magic. They obviously have their own smarts, but they're not tacticians. That's really important to understand. They're not the ones to come up with the plans, and they don't give orders. So I do believe that if Sauron and Durin's Bane had come to communicate with one another in some way, that either the Balrog would say, I'm staying right where I am, I'm not coming out, or more likely, Sauron would get to the bottom of why the Balrog was still hiding, probably an assumption that Middle-earth is still under occupation by the forces of the Valar, and Sauron would be able to say, actually, most of it is under my control right now. Why don't you come and join me in Mordor? You'll like it a lot better. And it is very likely that he would come. So why didn't Sauron do this? He didn't know about the Balrog. All right, let's move on to the next question. The next question comes in by the request of Walter White, who, by the way, congratulations to Walter White. He is now a moderator on my YouTube channel. So we have 2 moderators now in the live stream, so that's going to be fun. So not that we really need a lot of moderation. You guys have all behaved wonderfully, but it's just, just in case one person can't be there, it's good to have another person. Anyway, here's Walter's question. If the Horn of Gondor was made from the horn of an arrow that dwell near the Sea of Rune, would that also imply that the Valaróma, the horn of Orma, which he blew while he pursued the servants of Morgoth, was made from the same material, or could it have been fashioned from another beast, possibly from Aemon? So I was a little confused by the question at first, and then I had to sort of break it down and realize But there's just a little bit of a misunderstanding here. There's a good question in there, but I just have to clear up the misunderstanding first. The Great Horn, which is also called the Horn of Gondor, was the horn that Boromir carried, and it was eventually, when he died, it was cut in half by the orcs. It was put into Boromir's funeral boat, and the halves were retrieved by Faramir and brought to Denethor. It was not made out of the horn of an Aerau. It was made from the horn of the kine of Aerau, according to Appendix A of the Lord of the Rings. In other words, it was made from the horn of cattle. Kine, that's K-I-N-E, is the plural form of kai, which is spelled K-I-E. And that's a Middle English word that means cattle. Pluralizing words in Middle English, just like in Old English, was usually adding an E-N to the end of the word. So K-I-E plus E-N is kine. It's spelled K-I-N-E because that way we know how to pronounce it. The kine of Aerau were wild cattle from the east, which in one of Tolkien's unpublished manuscripts, it only exists in a museum, he said they were similar to a real European species of cattle, which we call an aurochs. Ironically, pluralizing aurochs makes it auroch. So knowing that Aerau is not the name of an animal, but a description of what these animals are of, well, then we ask, what is Aerau? Aerau is actually just the Sindarin name for Oroma. So Sindar have different names for all of the Valar, and they're used in the Lord of the Rings, where Sindarin is more common than Quenya is. This is the reason that Varda is referred to as Elbereth. So the kine of Aerau is just another way of saying Oroma's cattle. These animals were believed to have been descended from the cattle that Oroma kept, and thus that's what they were called. So now I said that there was actually a good question in here, and there really is. So is there a connection to the Valaróma? Possibly, but keep in mind that for the Valaróma to be something that Oroma was going to blow into, it was probably a lot bigger than the horn that the likes of Boromir would be able to use. The Valar were just huge compared to men. So it's very possible that the kine that Oroma kept in the deeps of time were just a lot bigger, and it's possible that they diminished over time, much like his own horse might be, as big as it was able to carry him and 3 elves, and that may have been a distant, very, very distant ancestor of Shadowfax. So could it be made of the same material? Yes, in the way that Boromir is like Elros, if you understand my meaning there. All right, let's move on to the next question. Okay, our next question came in from the user Ace Gang, who says, "Hey, big fan of your videos. My question is, what kind of king was Isildur, and for how long did he rule after Sauron's defeat? What were the circumstances that led to his death?" Well, for the last one, the circumstances that led to his death, I would recommend you read the Unfinished Tales, the story, the disaster of the Gladden Fields, but actually it's mentioned in the Council of Elrond too. Elrond kind of tells the story there. It's just the version in Unfinished Tales is very detailed, and I'm going to go into some stuff from that as well. But yeah, basically the circumstances behind his death, that's the quickest thing to get into. So I'll get into it first, is that he was traveling to the north, and he was waylaid by orcs, him and his company, and there was a big battle, and he managed to escape by using the One Ring. But then as he was swimming in the Anduin River, it slipped from his fingers, and as he came up for air on the other side of the river, he was visible, and he got shot in the neck by a poisoned arrow, and he fell into the river and died. So, as for everything else, we actually don't get to know a lot about Isildur as the High King, because he only reigned for 2 years. We can infer a few things from the limited dialogue found in Unfinished Tales, as well as information from other sources, though. It is clear that Isildur wished to continue the tradition that was set down by his father Elendil in keeping his realm as one land, with a high king and then 2 lesser kings, one in the north and one in the south. As both Elendil, his father, and Isildur's younger brother Anarion had died, Isildur became the High King, and thus the King of Gondor became Anarion's son Meneldil, and I'm going to talk a lot about Meneldil. So he became the King of Gondor, while Isildur's eldest son Elendur would become the King of Arnor. But that wasn't meant to be. That just didn't happen, because not only did Isildur die at the disaster of the Gladden Fields, but so did Elendur and two more of his sons, named Aratan and Cirion, that left only his underage son Volandil as an heir, and he was already, with Elrond and Imladris. Now, at this point, if they had kept the Númenórean tradition, what should have happened in this Númenórean tradition is that Meneldil should have become the High King, and then Volandil would be the boy king of Arnor with Elrond as his chancellor until his 25th birthday, and then Gondor would be left to his son, to Meneldil's son, Commendor, who was actually in his 40s already, so he would have been able to become the king. However, this didn't happen, possibly due to the type of person that Isildur was as a ruler, and definitely due to the type of person that Meneldil was as a ruler. In the disaster of the Gladden Fields, we get characters that practically worship Isildur, but we're talking about his sons and his closest confidants. Of course, they like him. Meneldil, though, he seems to have a different opinion of his uncle, as we see in this passage. Meneldil was the nephew of Isildur, son of Isildur's younger brother Anarion, slain in the siege of Barad-dûr. Isildur had established Meneldil as king of Gondor. He was a man of courtesy, but far-seeing, and he did not reveal his thoughts. He was, in fact, well pleased by the departure of Isildur and his sons, and hoped that affairs in the north would keep them long occupied. So then there's a further footnote that mentions two other facts about Meneldil. One, that he was the fourth child of Anarion. What happened to the other three is not mentioned, but it's probable that they died in the war against Sauron, even before the siege of Barad-dûr. And that Meneldil was actually the last man to be born in Númenor. As Meneldil was the last man to be born in Númenor, this means that all of his children were born in Middle-earth. And it's also very likely that his unnamed wife was probably from Middle-earth as well. Meneldil, and therefore Gondor, was more of Middle-earth than it was of Númenor. And we see this have reverberating effects right down all the way to the Lord of the Rings, in which it's mentioned that the Dunedain of Gondor had more readily mixed and intermarried with the non-Dunedain, the people of Middle-earth, than those of the Northland of Arnor. This leaves the northern Dunedain more pure in terms of Númenórean blood, which winds up being advantageous to Aragorn. But we're meant to understand that Gondor mixing blood like that was actually a good thing. Gondor, over the years, they declined in population. They even gave up a large portion of their land to their allies in the creation of Rohan. Arnor, at this point, though, it was just gone. It splintered into three separate kingdoms because of a contested succession, and then just eventually petered out to the point where they stopped being royalty and they started being rangers. So thus, Meneldil I would deem to be a very wise king who knew that Gondor was a kingdom of Middle-earth and not a continuation of Númenor. Númenor was a failed state. So choosing to allow Númenor to be in the past is the reason why Gondor was stronger. And Tolkien agrees with this assessment with his estimation that Meneldil was far-sighted and courteous and reserved. So what about Isildur? He was likely, in my estimation, an overbearing person. His nephew couldn't wait for him to be gone and hoped that whatever business he had in the north is just going to take a long time because he'll be out of his hair for a long time. Meneldil wanted to build Gondor up his way and not be watched over by his uncle. Of course, this is the opinion of one family member and king and not of his subjects. But we aren't told what Isildur's subjects thought about him as a person, if they even knew about him as a person at all. And that Isildur, he only ruled for 2 years. We don't really have a lot to go on, but my impression is that Isildur may have been a bit overbearing and controlling. Now, there's reason for this. Of course, the personalities of Isildur and Meneldiel are going to be tempered by their own experiences. They had both seen horrors. They both had great losses. They dealt with it in different ways. It's very probable that Isildur's controlling tendencies were more Sauron's controlling tendencies, because Isildur was not only in possession of the One Ring throughout this period, but was actively trying to use it. He eventually came to see this was foolish, especially as the ring fought against him and gave him great pain, and the fact that he wished to use such a thing at all, I think it speaks to the thought that he may have been an ambitious ruler who wished to dominate others on some level, just not to the level that, the extremes that Sauron would go to, so the ring winds up rejecting him. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question was sent to me by Tommy Does Chile, who asks, can you do a movie review for the War of the Rohirrim? Thanks in advance. I love the channel. Yeah, so totally. As a matter of fact, this actually came up on a live stream where somebody, I think it was Tommy Loves Chile, says, hey, did you ever do a review of The Lord of the Rings, the War of the Rohirrim? And I said, no, but if you want to submit it as a question, I'd be happy to. So here we are. So I like the movie quite a lot. Actually, it doesn't reach the heights of cinema that the Peter Jackson, trilogy version of The Lord of the Rings did, but it was far more entertaining and had far more of a ring of truth to it than, the Hobbit trilogy did. The term fan fiction, this gets bandied about a lot. Tolkien would have preferred the term subcreation, and sometimes it's used as sort of a pejorative. But as I've pointed out time and time again, Tolkien was pro-fan fiction. He might, upon seeing the subcreations that were created after his death, which would include Peter Jackson's efforts, he might have disagreed with the choices that were made. He might actually hate them for various reasons. Certainly, I can't see him sitting all the way through the Desolation of Smaug without, flying into a fit of rage. But he would agree that the creator has a right to make them, even if they weren't to his liking. Would he have liked the War of the Rohirrim? I think he would have, positive things to say, and he would have negative things to say. But it's not Tolkien's opinion you're asking for here. You're asking for mine. So let's get it out of the way. The film is actually an ashcan, which means it was made to held onto rights before they revert back to an earlier point of origin. This was due to the fact that the big live-action film that they're planning, The Hunt for Gollum, was going to be delayed, so they needed to make something that was fast and cheap, so we get anime, which can be both. It's not always fast and cheap, but it can be fast and cheap. Anime, I'm going to be honest with you here, it's not a medium that I tend to appreciate, aside from like Castlevania on Netflix. It's just not my thing. And I appreciated Castlevania because of its reverence for the source material, so of course I'm going to give this more than a fair shot. It's Lord of the Rings. The animation is really good. It's fluid, though sometimes I think the characters didn't necessarily look like they belonged to their surroundings. The voice acting was good. I felt all the characters felt realized. I enjoyed the casting of Brian Cox as Helm Hammerhand, and having Miranda Otto as the narrator was a neat touch. I was pleasantly shocked at the usage of a non-AI Christopher Lee. The one line that he had was a composite of some existing lines from previous films. On a technical level, the movie's great. The story is true to the soul of the original story, if not the explicit details, and that's understandable due to the fact that the story was really only outlined in the appendix. It wasn't told as a narrative. All the characters that are meant to survive do, all the characters that are meant to die do, just maybe not in the same exact order or fashion. The main villain, Wolf, is made a little bit more sympathetic, but that only served to heighten his inevitable cruelty. Helm's daughter, they wound up naming her Hera. She was not named in the original text. She takes center stage, and we learn more about the Shield Maidens of Rohan. And I think that making the movie Rohan-centric also was wonderful because it gave us a lot of usage of Howard Shore's score from The Two Towers, the Rohan theme, which I always really liked. My only big issue with the film that took me out of the experience, it wasn't a lore issue, it wasn't a story issue. The story is, after all, a fleshed out version of an outline, and I didn't particularly care if Hera's brothers, they all die in slightly different ways or in a slightly different order. I don't mind that the castle was called the Hornburg and then changed to Helm's Deep in the movie. In the book, the castle was called the Soothburg, and then it was changed to the Hornburg, and the valley that surrounds it is Helm's Deep. But that actually makes sense that they changed that because it keeps in continuity with the earlier Peter Jackson films. None of that actually bothered me. No, it was this big, stupid siege tower. That actually bothered me. Siege towers just don't work the way that they're shown in the movie, and I just couldn't get it out of my head. It was taking me out of the movie a little bit. They do work that way, just not to that extreme. Normally, you build a siege tower either up close or you build it far away, and then you would wheel it up to the walls that you're putting under siege. The bridge extends and people cross over and they invade. In the movie, they built it really far away from the Hornburg, and they wanted to be out of range of the archers of Rohan. And, then they make this massive bridge. It's really, really long, and it extends all the way to the fortress walls, and it somehow doesn't immediately collapse despite being way too long, and it doesn't have any support struts. So I thought to myself, there's no way that can support people. And then they were even riding horses across it, which I don't even know how they got the horses up to the tower. But let's not think about that too much. I suppose the Dunlendings don't want to lose men in the act of wheeling it up to the walls, but it stands to reason to me that at least that if they didn't have the forces to get near the walls without the losses from the archers being untenable, then they honestly didn't have enough men to really do anything once they got over the wall. They could have built trebuchets to give supporting cover fire to suppress archers while moving the tower. That would have been a smarter move. That bothered me, but everything else about the film was really good. It was imperfect, but entertaining, and it was respectful to the lore of Tolkien and the spirit of the lore of Tolkien, at least. It just wasn't necessarily respectful to physics. One day I will do a reaction to it as well. I got to get back on the reaction thing. There was a whole copyright issue. We'll talk about it one day when we'll resume the Rankin Bass Hobbit reaction. Anyway, let's go on to the next question. Here I have another question from Tommy Does Chile, who asks, what battle between the Balrogs do you find the most impressive? Feanor versus them all, but he doesn't kill any, or Glorfindel's battle, and killing one in Gondolin. I'm excluding Gandalf since he's a Maya. I think Feanor holding off the whole lot of them speaks to his greatness personally, but would like to hear your insight. Cheers. Okay, so I suppose which battle is the most impressive is just really an incredibly subjective question. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I think that it's fun when I'm asked for an opinion to break up lore questions. A lot of people are looking for facts. That's great. Some people are looking for opinions, and that's also great. I think it differs differently on what a person finds to be impressive. So let's look at the known Balrog battles, of which there are 5, with one being apocryphal, but I'm including it for posterity. So the first one is Feanor versus the Balrogs in the Silmarillion. We don't know how many Balrogs there were, some or all in this battle. And even if it was all of them, the number was never really solidified. The fandom is largely settled on the number 7. Regardless, Feanor did not slay any Balrogs in this instance. Feanor dies, but he manages to hold his own against multiple Balrogs. In this instance, I would think it's an excellent demonstration of determination. Feanor's greatest strength is determination, and his greatest weakness is determination. The second one I'll talk about is Ecthelion versus Gothmog in the Fall of Gondolin. Ecthelion kills Gothmog, the lord and the greatest of the Balrogs, sacrificing his own life in the process. The Silmarillion's account of this is very brief. It just states that they both died, but the more detailed and possibly apocryphal account states that he dragged Gothmog underwater and then held them there until they both drowned. Gothmog was the most dangerous Balrog, and Ecthelion took him out while sustaining no harm from the Balrog, but knowing that he would die in the process from drowning. This one shows a great example of courage, the willingness to overcome fear and do the hard thing. This is somewhat tempered by the fact that Ecthelion was well aware that he would not truly die, but that he still went through the painful, slow, torturous death of drowning, knowing that he was taking out a major player in Morgoth's army. The third is Glorfindel versus a Balrog in the Fall of Gondolin. This one's unique in that the Balrog attacked a group of people, and then Glorfindel sort of seamlessly jumped to their defense, putting himself in front of the refugees. Glorfindel sustains no injury and easily kills the Balrog, only dying because it snagged his hair as it fell into the ravine. This battle is a great example of skill, as Glorfindel is the only one to kill a Maya Balrog with ease, his undoing just being the hair thing. The fourth one that we'll talk about is Tur versus multiple Balrogs in the primitive version of the Fall of Gondolin. Now, this one's considered apocrypha, as it is from an earlier draft in which Balrogs were less dangerous, more numerous, and they were just large, dangerous creatures. They weren't Maya spirits. However, we have reason to believe that all Balrogs in this primitive story are the progeny of Melko, or Morgoth himself, as Gothmog was explicitly said to be Melko's son. Now, it is possible that primitive Gothmog might not actually be a Balrog, he's just their lord, but it's also possible that the Balrogs are his own children and siblings. Tur kills 5 Balrogs without sustaining any injury, the greatest feat of battle that Tolkien wrote in his earliest stories. In the Legendarian's dubious canon, it would be a story told about Tur by men, while the Silmarillion is telling the same story about him by elves. The men were likely of Numenor and the latter Gondor, and this is a great example of hero worship. Tur gets elevated to this sort of Balrog slaying machine by men who emphasize and exaggerate his accomplishments, and they probably don't understand what Balrogs actually are. And then the last one is Gandalf versus Durin's Bane in The Lord of the Rings. This one's impressive, and I don't think it should be discounted. Gandalf was a Maya spirit, yes, but he was also an incarnate stuck in an aged and frail body. It was also a battle that started with a blast of magic, continued with a chase, and then an epic speech, a clash, a very long fall, followed by 11 straight days of battle and pursuit. Gandalf also won. He only collapsed and died after Durin's Bane was slain, and it was likely that he died of exhaustion and dehydration and hunger. It can also be pointed out that Gandalf was already tired when the Balrog came, so who knows how well he would have done if he was well rested. This one is a great example of stamina. As an old man, an angel, but a flesh and blood old man nonetheless, battling and chasing for over a week, I think it's incredibly impressive. So, which one you may find the most impressive is depending. Gandalf's the most epic, Glorfindel's the most decisive, Feanor is the most violent, Ecdelion invokes respect. In my opinion, I would also factor in their motivations. Feanor was selfish. Sure, he wanted to stop Morgoth, but his main motivation was the Silmarils. He was being selfish, he was being rash, he was being hasty. Ecdelion and Glorfindel and Gandalf were all battling specifically to save other people, and in this case, I would state that Gandalf versus Durin's Bane is the most impressive. My reasoning is that in Tolkien's letters, we get a little bit more of Gandalf's thoughts. He thought that Frodo's journey was destined to fail without his assistance, that he must accompany Frodo all the way to Mordor. And now, he's separating himself and possibly dying to save Frodo, and he doesn't know that he's going to return in the way that he does, to stop a threat that could become another Sauron or even ally with him, as we talked about earlier. Gandalf's not only sacrificing himself, he's sacrificing the quest itself. He believed that Frodo would fail, so he has to put his faith into Frodo and into Aragorn while sacrificing himself, and that I think is the most impressive. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Digital Systematic, who asks, what is the range an Ainur can communicate with one another? Is it similar to incarnate beings, or can they converse over vast distances without the aid of tools such as the Palantir? When a great council is called, how does Ulmo know to return? Excellent questions. The answer boils down to it depends, actually. To dive into the idea of this form of communication, and there's actually two forms of communication here. There's asanwakenta, which is the communication of thoughts, and there's indemar, which is the communication of images. So to dive into this, we must look to the in-universe writings of the Noldor elf Pengaloth, who was a lore master of Gondolin. Now, really, these are, of course, Tolkien's own notes that are presented as being from an in-universe lore master from which he translated. These notes appear in the Vinyar Tangwar, as well as Morgoth's Ring, and then they were fully collected in the Nature of Middle-earth. So, according to Pengaloth, all minds can use the telepathic communication, as all minds are on equal footing. They just vary in strength of will, with Iluvatar at the top, and then the Valar, and the Maiar, and the Elves, and then finally the men. The dwarves aren't considered in this, but it's likely because the Noldor didn't care to know the minds of dwarves, as they are indeed incarnates, though, so I would say that they're probably on par with men in this instance. He goes into a lot of detail about how it works, but what it boils down to is that there is a sender and a receiver, which he refers to as a guest and a host. So the limitations that he refers to don't mention distance. He talks about affinity and urgency as being the limiters. Affinity is very simple. It's easier to share thoughts with somebody who is kith or kin than it would be to share with perfect strangers. Urgency states that great emotion can strengthen the ability, such as grief or joy or fear. He also states the authority can strengthen it. So your ability to send mind pictures or mind words may be hampered if you're of a lesser authority than the host, or if you're not friendly with them, or the message is just not all that important. Idle chatter can be shared in this way with good affinity, but you can't go just bugging Manwa with, thoughts on the weather in this way. The big barrier is actually a state of readiness. You cannot force thoughts onto others if their mind is not open, nor can you force their mind to be open. The example here is that Melkor was able to lie to Manwë, and as his mind was not open to Manwë, Manwë was forced to take him at his word. He was unaccustomed to treachery or deception and unable to see, his brother's true mind, so he had to just sort of take his word for it. The matter of range is dependent on the strength of the guest's mind as well as the state of the host's readiness. The Valar sent a dream to Faramir and Boromir from a great distance. Our minds are open to this communication when we're sleeping. These visions can be sent to an awakened mind in the form of mind pictures, which can appear as hallucinations. But when it comes to communication with men often interpret these visions as being something real and not a projected image. So range isn't actually an issue, but rather whether or not the host is going to be open to communication and how effective it's going to be, whether they're going to understand that what they're seeing isn't real. It's also important to note that having a hroa, which is a real flesh body, actually dampens the ability to send and receive these sort of images and thoughts. So while the Valar can project all the way from the Undying Lands, Gandalf is only able to communicate to Elrond and Galadriel when they're nearby, and Galadriel also mentions at one point that Gandalf's mind is always closed unless he's within the boundaries of Lothlorien. For the specifics regarding Ulmo, the most interesting of the Valar, in my opinion, he was very much the sort of guy who would say, this meeting should have been an email. He was notorious for only showing up for meetings or great councils that he thought were important. So it's reasonable to assume that he gets a call from Manwë and that they're going to meet in the Ring of Doom and your presence is requested, and then he decides whether it's going to be a Zoom meeting or an in-person meeting, or if he's just leaving them on red. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question, sorry, I was just eating a pretzel. Our next question comes in by the request of Matt Tyree, who asks, if Sauron remains in parity with the ring, even when not wearing it, wouldn't it be safer to hide it away in a heavily guarded or unreachable place? Not to answer a question with a question, but if he did that, what would even be the point of having the ring? There is a bit of confusion about the ring's function here. Tolkien wrote in his letters that while Sauron was not wearing the ring, he was in rapport with the power that's within the ring. This means that simply taking the ring off or being separated by a long distance from the power of the ring doesn't actually weaken Sauron. However, in the same letter, Tolkien also explained that wearing the ring boosts his power. Now, I want you to think about it this way. I'm going to throw a bunch of numbers at you, and it's not at all accurate or meant to be taken seriously. I'm just using this as just an example. So basically, I'm saying this isn't to scale, so just bear with me here. Think of it this way. So Sauron alone, he's at his baseline. We'll call it 100%. He creates the ring and allows the greater part of his power, let's say that's 75% of his power, just for the sake of argument, passes into the ring. So in this situation, we can say that 25% of Sauron exists within his fauna, which is his body, non-flesh and blood body, and 75% is in the ring. Now, the ring wasn't made to hold part of his soul. That would be very silly for Sauron to do. He put his soul into it to power the magic of the ring, and the purpose of the ring is to dominate the will of others. So if he's sitting on his throne and the ring is like in a safe, he's still at 100% because none of his power has been dissipated or spent or destroyed. He is in rapport with the ring in the sense that it has not been destroyed and that all of Sauron still exists. But if Sauron wishes to use the ring for its intended purpose, he needs to wear it. That's just how it was designed. He needs to bend his will towards the domination of others. This would put him at, well, the numbers would be based on the power of every person he dominates in relation to him. So for the sake of argument, let's just make up some numbers. We'll say that Galadriel and Elrond are 70% of a Sauron unit. Gandalf is 90% of a Sauron unit. If he manages to dominate them, he's at, theoretically, 330%. If any of these characters become wraiths, he would then not need to bend his will toward them anymore, and they would become interdependent extensions of him. They're able to act without him, but not act against him. Now, the scenario that I explained is completely unrealistic. If Sauron regained the ring, Gandalf and Galadriel and Elrond are just going to take their rings off, but they would be deprived of the benefits of their rings, and they would become weaker, not to mention that there would be no real path to victory against Sauron. The numbers, they were arbitrary, made-up nonsense. Just to illustrate a point, the ring makes Sauron stronger when he's wearing it. Not wearing it doesn't diminish him. It just puts him back at his baseline. Hiding it doesn't work. Now, you could argue that he could just not, have physically worn it when he fought Elendil and Gil-galad, but the fact is, if he won, he won, and if he lost, it was possible that they'd still find it in his tower anyway. He didn't think of the ring as a danger to himself, which was his mistake. He thought of it as a tool to dominate. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by Link of Wise, who asks, why do the trolls seen in The Hobbit appear far more intelligent than the ones in The Lord of the Rings? Could they actually talk, or is this just something that Bilbo made up? I would say that the trolls in The Hobbit are far less intelligent than the ones in The Lord of the Rings, and I really can't see how you would, or anyone would see it otherwise. Now, a concession. There is likely a great deal of the chapter Roast Mutton, the second chapter of The Hobbit, that Bilbo is exaggerating or playing things down or censoring or otherwise altering what really happened to make for a better story. This would include his narrative observation that while these three trolls were dim-witted, they were some of the more bright trolls out there, as well as their ridiculous English-sounding names, including one who has a surname, William Huggins. This would certainly be something that Bilbo made up to make them characters in his story rather than, simply just being a danger. Now, that hobbits are, for the most part, the only intelligent beings that are extant to Middle-earth that generally use surnames. We hear very occasionally of men doing this, such as Barlam and Butterbur and Bill Ferny, but it's not really very common, and likely it's actually probably a Hobbit influence on Bree. Most of the characters are single names, sometimes with an epesse or son of or from the house of type of thing. That being said, we know the troll situation really happened, and it was resolved in the way that Bilbo described it, because Merry and Pippin found the trolls in the Lord of the Rings, and they ran back to Aragorn in a panic, who wasn't really worried because it was daytime. Now, there's no indication in the Lord of the Rings that trolls are less intelligent, not a single bit. As a matter of fact, it's the opposite, with the narration stating that they had become more intelligent under Sauron. While it is true that trolls in the Lord of the Rings don't generally speak, they're really not in a position to speak. Their function is as dangerous foes in battle, and there isn't a whole lot of talking in battle. The Ologai, which is a particular type of troll, they are said to be particularly intelligent, and they could speak, but they only spoke the black speech of Mordor, and only when they thought it was necessary to speak. The trolls in The Hobbit are sort of magnificently stupid. Even if we discard the parts of Bilbo's stories that are probably, just made up nonsense, apocrypha, it seems odd that creatures that will absolutely die if the sun hits them will lose track of time that easily. The fact that Gandalf was able to keep them arguing for so long by imitating their voices tells us a lot. They were just dull. Just because somebody can speak doesn't mean they have more than 3 brain cells to rub together. And as evidence of that, I present to you everything in the world. Just listen to people. They'll say the most nutty, inane things, total non sequiturs, total just nonsense. They're just making noise to make noise. That doesn't make them smart. That's just the way it is. And I've met a lot of people who are very, very intelligent, and I've met a lot of people who are very, very unintelligent, and I'll tell you that the unintelligent people talk a lot more. All right, let's move on to the last question. Our final question came in from Walter White, and this is just a fun question here. I think it's fun, at least. What place would you go sightseeing in Middle-earth if it could be anywhere in any age? Well, so it's interesting to have the thought of any age and any place. It opens up a lot of possibilities, but I would also say that I value my safety. So I'm going to avoid anything to do with Beleriand or Numenor, especially as you did say Middle-earth, so Numenor wouldn't be included anyway. I would pick Lindon in the Second Age. If you look at the image that I have here, you can see that it's very similar to a lot of the depictions of Imladris, which is Rivendell. And that's very correct, as places like Rhegien, also called Hallen, and Imladris were basically vassal states of Lindon, or at least Imladris was a continuation of Lindon. Being in Lindon would mean there would be forests, there would be mountains, there would be the sea, the Suzats to the east, the Blue Mountains to the north, Old Forest and Tom Bombadil are not far away, and it's a place that, soundly told Sauron to go pound sand when he came in fair guise. It would also mean great company, the likes of Gil-galad, the greatest High King of the Noldor ever, and then Círdan's there. He's the oldest and most far-seeing and wise elf in Middle-earth. It just has a little bit of everything. I think it would be the best place for sightseeing and the safest place for sightseeing. Anyway, that's our last question, but let's move on to the quizzes. So to review the quizzes that I put up for the past week, and we're going to make this a regular thing, I'm going to put the images up here that show the results of the quiz. I'm not going to say the results of the quiz because I'm recording this one day. I'm recording this on a Tuesday night, and then the next day, Wednesday evening, is when I'll be editing it. So when I grab the images, the percentages might change slightly. So just a note on these quizzes before I get into it: these are meant for fun. They're not meant to be taken seriously. We're not trying to have arguments. I'm going to go over, as I go through them, some of the comments that I've gotten from people. I'm not going to put anybody on blast or anything, and just say, don't do those particular things. And please, you can leave comments on these quizzes, by the way. You want to say something like, hey, I got it right, or hey, I got it wrong, or that was an easy one, or that was a hard one, or whatever. That's fine. But don't post any sort of hint that might tell people what the right answer is or what the wrong answer is. And if you see a typo or something, we'll get into that in one of these. I can't edit them once I post them. So if I make a little typographical error, it's stuck there. So here we go. So here's the first one where I asked, what was the name of Bard's son who became the King of Dale after his death? And I was being a little tricksy with this one. This is the one that I hastily wrote out while I was streaming. And the choices are Brand, Bane, Beregond, and Beleg. And as you can see, most people chose Brand. It's just actually the incorrect answer. And the reason that most people chose Brand is because Brand was the king of Dale during the Lord of the Rings, but he's not Bard's son. He's Bard's grandson. His father was Bane. Bane was the son of Bard. Bane was a boy king who didn't live very long, so he's not that important, but he did exist. Beregond is a man from Minas Tirith. He has nothing to do with Dale, and Beleg was an elf from the First Age who was accidentally killed by Turin Turambar, which is a rather important event that happens during the story The Children of Húrin. Moving on to our next one, what was the name of Peregrine Pippin Took's wife? And the answers that I gave are Amethyst, Ruby, Diamond, and Pearl. I was so tempted to write Anne Stephen at the end of it, but I resisted. The correct answer is actually Diamond. More people went for Ruby, and Pearl was actually the top answer, probably because out of all of these, Pearl is the most likely to be a woman's name. Although I have a cousin named Ruby, and I have a friend named Amethyst, so there is that as well. I've ran into people named Diamond. They're pretty rare, but Diamond was a Hobbit woman. We don't know much about her. She was from a village called Longcleave, which was in the North Farthing, and her and Pippin had a son who he named Faramir. The other names, like I said, they're just gem names. They're not names from the Legendarium. I just thought, since we have Diamond, let's put some other gems in there. Our next quiz was, which of the following is not one of Gandalf's names? So I included the names as well as the translation. We have Lothspel, which means ill news. We have Incanus, which means northern spy. I made a typo there. I wrote Ecanus. I left out the N, but and I'll talk about that in a moment. We have Olorin, which basically means dreamer, and Zigur, which means sorcerer. As you can see, most people got this one right. I'm surprised that anybody said Olorin. That's his actual real name. Lothspel, which means ill news, was what Grima Wormtongue called him. Incanus was something that he was called in the south. It means northern spy. Olorin's his real name. Zigur was actually Sauron's name in Numenor. Oh, that's what he called himself in Numenor, or at least that's what the Númenóreans called him. They called him Zigur. It just means sorcerer. And this is the one where I got one person that was commenting saying that Ecanus was spelled wrong, which is fair to point out. But he it was a very nasty comment because he's like, Ecanus is not a name, it's actually Incanus. I would make a comment about the state of academia, but I won't. And it's like, dude, are you okay? Who hurt you? Really, who hurt you? Why are you like this? It's a simple typo. And it's not about if I make an accidental typo like that. I included the translations so you know which name I'm talking about. So it's not like, it's completely made up nonsense, And, it's about picking which is the right answer. And then he said, well, there is no right answer. And I'm like, huh? What do you mean by that? So I said, no, there very clearly is a correct answer. And he said, there are two correct answers because Ecanus is not one of Gandalf's name. And I'm like, dude, I already said that that's a typo, man. Like, what are you talking about? And also, you went from there's no right answer to there's two right answers really quick. So like I said, mistakes happen. Typos happen. I will tell you that when I answer these questions, I'm initially writing them out. Even the ones that are submitted on YouTube, I post them on Quora as articles. And I make a lot of typos. And then I go back and I read it and I go, oh, we got to fix that and that and that and that. I edit myself. I don't have an editor. But I type everything up rather quickly because most of the time that I spent on this is research, not so much the actual typing, and I just type fast normally. Typos happen all the time, and I try to fix them, but for whatever reason with YouTube quizzes, I cannot edit anything. I can understand why I couldn't edit the choices, but I can't edit the title or anything or the explanation that pops up when you answer it. All right, our next quiz, and here it is. What is the name of Aragorn's mother? And I'm pleased to see that most people got this right. It's Gilrain. Gilrain was his mother. She actually died during The Lord of the Rings in the time period between Bilbo's birthday party and Frodo leaving on his journey, which was a period of 17 years. She died a few years into that. Evorwen is actually... That's actually Gandalf. That's actually Aragorn's grandmother. Firiel is a name that appears just a bunch of times in the Legendarium, and one of Aragorn's ancestors is called Firiel, but not his mother. And then the last one is Erendis, who was the name of a queen of Numenor from the story The Mariner's Wife in Unfinished Tales. So they all go further back. They're all related to Aragorn. It's just that the correct one was Gilrain. Our next quiz here is, which of the following characters have never killed a Balrog? And most people got this right. We have Gandalf, Ecthelion, Eärendil, and Glorfindel. And of course, you guys know the answer to it because we went over like every battle where anybody killed a Balrog in an earlier part of the video. So I'm glad that most people knew that it was Eärendil. Eärendil was famous for killing Ancalagon the Black, which was a dragon, the largest of all dragons and the largest of the winged dragons as well, that almost won the war for Morgoth until Eärendil came and fought him for a full day and slew him. But we never were told about Eärendil fighting or slaying any of the Balrogs. Of course, Gandalf and Ecthelion and Glorfindel all killed Balrogs. I actually have to repost this, which is probably why the numbers are the way they are, because I made a mistake. This wasn't even a typo. This was just my mind wandering. When I went to type Glorfindel, I typed Gandalf, so there were 2 Gandalfs on it. And once I realized that, I quickly deleted it and reposted it. But I think, a lot of people had already voted. And here's our last quiz here. Which of these characters did Frodo not offer the One Ring to? And we have Aragorn, Elrond, Galadriel, and Gandalf. And thankfully, most of you guys got this right. Elrond, he did not ever actually offer the ring to Elrond. He set out on his journey specifically to bring the ring to Rivendell, and probably it was in his mind that he was going to hand it over to Elrond and that he was going to lay low for a while and then he was going to eventually go home once the heat died down. But he never got to the point of offering it to Elrond. At the Council of Elrond, he actually offered it to Aragorn when he found out who Aragorn really was. He had already offered it to Gandalf, and of course he would offer it to Galadriel later in the story. I almost put the Witch King in here instead of Elrond because I thought that would be kind of funny, because he kind of offers it to the Witch King in the movie, but we're not talking about the movies, we're talking about the books. So, and I thought it'd be funny if people thought, well, he definitely offered it to the Witch King, but of course he didn't, because that only happened in the movie. But I thought Elrond was more interesting, considering that he was planning on giving the ring to Elrond, but Elrond wound up saying that he would not keep the ring, not even to keep it safe. So no such offer was ever made. Anyway, that's our last quiz. And like I said, I'm going to do a quiz a day as long as I'm able to and I remember to. And we'll review them at the end of each video, which I think is a cool little addition to these videos. And I think it's fun. Keep in mind, guys, these are for fun, okay? There was, I forget which one of these, but somebody was saying, well, if we're being technical, it was about killing the Balrogs, and they're saying, well, nobody has ever actually killed a Balrog because they're Mayan, this and that. And I go, look, I can get into the whole thing about killing versus make dead, because, you can kill a Maya, they just don't stay dead. Sauron was killed a few times, but you know what I'm talking about. It's just for fun. This is just something that I thought would be cute. You might learn some things. You can participate in the channel. I only upload once or twice a week, so it's good to keep the channel active and keep people engaged. Anyway, that's all our content for the day. I'm going to ask at this point that if you got all the way through the video, please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Like the video, leave me a comment. Let's get that engagement up. Let's get people talking about the channel. Recommend it to friends if you know anybody that's into Tolkien or might be interested in this sort of thing. And of course, consider membership. Membership would really help me out. It only costs $5 a month. We have a bunch of members. We could use a bunch more. Like I said, it really helps me out, and you get to see all the videos early, at least a week early, which is really cool. Some of the videos, like the ones that go up on Fridays, you'll sometimes see them like a month early, and you get to, your comments get first crack there, since the videos are only members for that period of time. And I'm never going to have a video that stays members only. I want everybody to have access to my content because it is educational, but I do have to make it worth it to be a member. And like I said, or even if you just want to help me out, it does help me out. Anyway, guys, that's all we have for today, and I'll see you next week.